So welcome to today's podcast. Thanks for joining me as always. This week was interesting. I was able to attend a family member's 65th birthday party. Mother is turning 90, which is just shocking to even consider. We get to celebrate her birthday. It's quite amazing. And you kind of reflect on it. And I thought, just like anyone, it says, wow, time really does fly. And some days seem slow, but when you really step back from it, it moves so quickly. And recognize it's temporary. We're obviously all going to leave this earth at some point. But, as you're seeing things, it's not that uncommon now to see people living into their 90s, maybe hundreds, and sort of have to plan for that. It's just different than we used to think. Obviously, we're living longer these days. So that comes with other sorts of challenges or things to consider as we move forward. And so I thought I'd do this podcast to kind of talk about this topic because there's a lot of different facets of it, especially as it relates to your wealth building and use of your wealth over your lifetime. And so I just want to share some of my thoughts around this, and hopefully it gives you some things to consider and evaluate even your own plan of how you're thinking about it for your future. So one of the things I always think about is, what if you live to 95 or 100? Right? Have you really planned that out and thought through what that actually might mean? And a lot of responses I get from people are like, there's no way in hell I'm going to want to live that long and have absolutely no sort of life, right? To me, I might be sort of vegetable sitting somewhere and not enjoying life at all. I don't want to live that kind of life. There's no point in living that long. Hopefully there is some ways that you can actually have not just longevity, but a healthy life too, right? Not just breathing, right? And sort of sitting there watching TV or something like that. So as a quick thought experiment, like if you're healthy and successful, and I think for most people listening to this, or continuing to stay educated and growing, you're probably not average. So why do people, when they plan, and especially around their financial planning, factor in the average life expectancy, right? Live into your 70s or 80s. And why wouldn't you plan for much, much longer? Because the reality is that you likely will, right? Especially if you're successful, healthy, educated, you're likely going to. So what's really happening though now is that as people are living longer, especially those with wealth and, like I said, education, they're going to have longer lives. And if they're following the mantra of retirement and whatever that number is for you, 65, 60, whatever it is, that you literally could be in retirement for 30, 40, 50 years of your life. Even it could exceed the amount of years you actually worked, which is quite insane. I mean, a lot of stuff around Social Security, this is a time when, people used to only live to their late 60s or roughly. So obviously a lot of things have changed over time, but there are certain things that have stayed true. We might spend more time in retirement, quote unquote, than actually giving service in some capacity. So retirement really isn't really short anymore. And just on a personal note, I'm not really one to subscribe to the term retirement. One definition I heard over my years was to be put out of service. Well, that doesn't seem overly interesting to me or exciting to be put out of service like a piece of machinery. I truly believe we are been put on this earth for a purpose. We all have to figure that out and serve others at a highest level and impact what we can while we're here. We've been gifted with certain things, and I think we should use them. So I'm not a big proponent of that, but I understand that that's a common thread around retirement. And so maybe it's more of a transition, right, to a different sort of part of your life, which I think is really cool. And for people who are living longer, right, the biggest concern is, and we have this problem just more naturally in things to think really long-term about things. We're all guilty of this to some degree that, day by day, there are things that pop up that become top of mind, cause stress, whatever. And sometimes always difficult to think long-term, but it's something we do need to consider because the likelihood is we will live a lot longer. And hopefully with advancements in medicine and other things, that's just going to continue on and on. So when we look at that, maybe COVID kicked this off to some degree, we are active longer, even as we're getting older. And people are, I don't know if the 60s are the new 50s or whatever, but people are looking to maybe not stop working and trying to transition to a career, a new business venture, or another area in their lives that they kind of put on hold. I think people are getting energized by that. I think I come across more people who are starting a new business or getting into another area that they just put on the side over the years while they're working their job or career. And now they have the opportunity to pursue things that they always wanted to build that freedom in their lives. And that's kind of sort of ties into my world where I left corporate America and was able to stumble across what I felt was a passion of mine in my world, and how I share and empower others to control their own wealth is something that just fell into me as a passion and allowed me to sort of pursue different areas of my life that was always there and just never got the time and attention I always wanted. Creating more meaning in my life from a work perspective than my prior career. And I know a lot of people are looking for that and going down that path as well, and can help them sort of pursue things that really can give them more energy on a day-to-day basis. People don't want always retire. They want more freedom to choose how they spend their days, who they get to interact with, and what they get to do on a daily and weekly basis. There is a catch, though, around this living longer, because there are other financial things, obviously, to consider if you're living longer. If we knew exactly when we were going to pass on this earth, financial planning would be pretty easy, right? That we don't know that becomes a challenge. And, one of the big things I often hear from people around their financial futures are around healthcare, right? If we're living longer, we have to obviously supply our needs around cash flow for living and such. But what unfortunately is happening for a lot of people is towards the end of life, that's when their biggest bill of healthcare comes into play. And life, like living in assistance and things of that, long-term care, like these are things that could be astronomical in terms of cost. So that is definitely something people need to consider as they start walking into the later stages, because the final years of life could be hugely expensive and sort of drain all the wealth you've built up over years if you haven't planned properly for it. And so this is why it requires some planning well ahead of time. So it's not just about accumulation, building wealth. It's really, have you put in place bumpers and contingency plans so your wealth can last and absorb shocks that we know eventually will come? And healthcare is just one example, but there's tons of things that can erode wealth that can now set us back. But, are you prepared and have set in place the plans to ensure that you can withstand all those things? And there's not things that we want to always think about, right? It's not like we want to dwell on them all the time, but I think a healthy approach would be to actually just face those things. Those are realities of what can happen in life. Even the worst case scenario of us dying, that's just a reality of life. And, for me personally, it's helped me sort of actually give me more boost to my day-to-day living because of that knowledge. And so I can enjoy each day and try to get the most out of every single day, because we don't know. And so you can have a slightly different perspective on it, but think of those negative things that could happen and, prepare yourself for it financially, of course, and having plans in place, but also you can prepare an emotional level, right? If you've experienced it and thought through it a little bit, then when it comes, although it's not the best thing in the world that you want to experience, hopefully it helps you get through that a little bit easier and know it's just a fact of life of what's going to happen. Things will change. So from a financial planning perspective, right? Obviously, this is a wealth building podcast. A lot of the things that are set up were from a long time ago and haven't really sort of evolved as much, at least not mainstream. A lot of the quote unquote typical financial planning is still a little bit behind in my perspective. It's really centered around that Wall Street type of planning where you're saving, you're obviously investing primarily in the public markets, and then you're retiring and you do drawdowns, whatever, 4%, and these sorts of things. And it keeps that wealth sort of tied to the Wall Street investments for as long as possible. And so that's just a common thread around the average typical advice. Well, obviously, as anyone's looked into these things, recognizes that doesn't go in any streamlined, straight path, right? There's sequence of return risk, right? Because there could be volatility to markets, as people have experienced. We know there's a future of taxation coming for people when they have to use some of their, especially if they're tax deferred assets like in 401ks or IRAs, that they're going to be taxed on that stuff down the road, and they're not sure what that tax rate will be. So that will be a constant battle for people. We talked about the volatility, right? So you got to be able to, again, withstand the sort of ups and downs of markets and interest rates and tax, you name it, economies, right, for changes over time. Just the cycles of life that's going to occur. You just have to be prepared for those things. And they may not have prepared for the long runway, right? You're planning for the average of life expectancy, maybe 70s, 80s, wherever it is, like 78, I think it is now. And especially, again, if you're successful, more and more people live in their 90s into 100s. So a different approach that you can hopefully take earlier in life, and this is, again, preparing not just for retirement, but for your current lifestyle too, is a lot more focus on building cash flow, right? A lot of the advice is focused on, hey, just put money in there and get whatever return, 7-8% returns over long periods of time, and then use that money down the road. I would encourage folks to start thinking about how can you generate more types of cash flow along the way, whether it's in the business world or real estate or other sorts of ways to build cash flow. It just gives you optionality to retire if you want to, or switch gears, not just waiting for that end game of a massive amount of money in portfolio. And then you start using that asset to create income. Why not build it all along the way and have different streams of income, which we know most successful multimillionaires have a lot of different types of cash flow streams. The second thing I would consider is to really get much more focused on tax efficiency. I think it's too simplistic to say, hey, just put money in tax deferred, and then, hopefully at the end you're in a lower tax bracket, and that's the impact of tax planning. Well, obviously it's much more complicated than that. And for most people, it is the biggest expense. We talk about healthcare being very expensive down the road. Your biggest expense in your entire life will be taxes if you're successful. And it is an enormous cost when you factor in the opportunity cost that comes along with it. Any dollar you lose in paying taxes, it stops earning for literally for the rest of your life and decades and into future generations. Trying to capture more of those dollars to put it to work in productive assets is absolutely essential, right? Some people are paying 30, 40, 50% of their dollars, almost working, 30% of their year to pay taxes, or upwards of 50, right? And if you were to recapture even small chunks of that, that could be a massive sort of a benefit long run to building assets that can compound and grow over long periods of time. Unfortunately, most tax professionals are just too busy with a compliance arm to things. That's gotten way too complicated. And so they don't even have the time and energy to spend on proactive tax planning. And that's something that people should start considering and thinking about, because there's a massive amounts of wealth being transferred. The last two that I would suggest here, they have some sort of relationship, is flexibility. This is where part of it is having multiple streams of income so that you can decide to maybe change course in your life, your career, having some flexibility in doing something else that maybe gives you more energy in it. And for life, there's always a possibility that can create different streams of income and growth because it's something you're engaged with, you enjoy. So building that flexibility in your plan is key. And that gets into the idea of having the protections in place that you're protected as you're building wealth and generating wealth and planning, that you have different options because you've thought of those things ahead of time. Fill in any gaps in your wealth or as they may occur, or issues to give different asset type. You have options because you're not so concentrated in one different area. Now, last one is the optionality. I think optionality is more centered around having different streams of income that isn't just about parking money and having it accumulate for some rainy day, for the day you retire. Well, create as many as you can now, and so it builds up optionality for you to do what you want, change course, and gives you flexibility instead of being in that proverbial stuck in a job and I got to just sit through that and get through it, right? That's where we don't want to be. That's really not abundant thinking. It's probably painful for folks who want out, right? But you got to build that optionality in. So that's kind of more philosophical, but when you think about sort of wealth building in general, and I think of it in slightly different ways where it isn't just about wealth building. There's 4 forms of capital that we have. One is the financial capital. And we talked about it. It's about building assets along the way, and assets that can produce income earlier now, right? That you can use and consume management of cash flow as opposed to just accumulating wealth somewhere and having some really cohesive tax strategy. I think those are some of the common themes there. Health capital, I think, is one that is huge. And personally, this is something I've paid way more attention to these days. We talked about the idea that that's going to be a huge expense for a lot of people down the road, possibly. And so preparing for that. But one of the things is invest in your health, right? When we're working or busy with careers or jobs or businesses, paying attention to our health can be one of those things could easily slip away. And that can catch us real quick, right? It isn't, some of these things, again, it's similar to investing in some way. It's sometimes boring, methodical, over time can have a huge benefit like compounding, right, of wealth. But you got to do that too on the health side, right? Invest in your health, right? Obviously, get the advice of doctors and get the preventative aspects in your life and checkups and diagnostics, all those sorts of things, and then invest some time and energy and money into your health. You have one body, as far as I'm aware, and it's like you got to treat it that way. And so how's it going to withstand that length of time into the later years if you don't treat it right today? And so I really have grasped that personally, and I think it will help you also be able to be more active and energized on a daily basis, and it will help you hopefully be more productive in your careers and businesses. The third capital is relationship capital. And this is about family and friends, right? Things that most people probably say they're the most important things in their lives, but they may not always spend that time with them as much as they'd like. And building the connection and building out legacy sort of planning along the way. I think these things are hugely important for your personal sort of fulfillment, but it just gives you energy. And that goes along with even networking too, with like-minded type people, being around others that just bring you joy and energy. I think those are investments of time that are hard to measure how impactful they can be. I mean, I think it just is enjoyment. Looking forward to a trip that's coming up with some old people I went to school with and a golf trip. And I just couldn't be more fired up about it to be able to spend that time and be thankful to be able to have that time. And that'll give me sort of a nice boost as I come back to life and go into business and other things that I have other pursuits in. And the last one is purpose capital. And, we touched on this a bit before, is finding work that's meaningful, something that has, allows you to contribute in your own unique way. I do believe that's inherent to everyone to some degree. We all want to feel like we can have meaning. We do something of use in this world, right? We contribute in our own unique way. And it doesn't mean I have to build the biggest business in the world and be a billionaire. It could be as small as, hey, my job is to take care of my children and help them find their own path in life and get educated, all those things. Those are all meaningful things, but having that purpose is so key. And I think it can easily get lost when there's just a pursuit of things and money and status and all those things. So if you could take one thing away from all of that, is that, money alone cannot equal wealth. Wealth and all the different forms of capital that are I described there really can help you, build a very healthy, abundant life and really make you feel wealthy, even if your bank account doesn't show it all the time. I know it covered quite a lot around different forms of capital and thinking about wealth a little bit differently along the way. One of the things I really want you to think about is you're thinking about your financial plan and your longevity. Have you set up your plans so that they could work out to 95 to 100, right? How would they? And how could they even perpetuate beyond that if that's important to you? Am I only playing there where there's the average advice? When I am playing in spaces in my business, career, other areas of my life at a much higher level? How exposed am I to, say, taxes, right, that are impacting my lifestyle, creating additional losses in my life? Am I investing in my health like I invest in my portfolios and businesses or other things that you invest in? And last thing I would ask you is, what am I actually working towards? What is that vision in your life that you'd love to have that maybe you don't have today? What are some steps you can do to get closer to that so you can actually reach the goal of what your life was meant to be? not what your bank account tells you. So I covered quite a bit of ground, hopefully giving you some food for thought to think through kind of your situation and what areas of maybe you want to address going forward, so that your plan, whatever it is, your wealth plan holistically around your life, is set up for you to succeed at the highest level and allow you to play this game of life for as long as you want to be here, right? Hopefully well into the 90s and the hundreds, and so you can enjoy life, contribute, and be around others that you enjoy being around. And, to me, wealth is not just about money. It's about building freedom in your life and having some level of purpose and service that you can give to others. So thanks for joining me on this podcast, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks for joining me on this episode today. I really am grateful for you as listeners to the Perennial Pride podcast. I hope you're getting some tremendous value out of it and hopefully pushing you along your journey to financial freedom. I put this podcast together really to help you get more educated around your finances so that you feel empowered to live the life that you really want. And if you like the content that you heard today or watched, then I would encourage you to go to my website, perennialpride.com. There's tons of other content there. And you can access my book, Wealth Beyond the Numbers. You can buy it there on my website. It's a aggregation of a lot of great tips and tools I've learned to not only build my wealth in my accounts, but build wealth in my life and abundance and joy, and something that has a lot of my experiences in the journey that I've been on personally. Hopefully that can be also of value to you as you sort of move forward. So thanks again for being a Perennial Pride listener, and we'll see you on the next episode.